Well, the way that this war should end is that we should give the Ukrainians what they need to forcefully expel Russian troops from their sovereign territory, and that includes Crimea. If that, and then after that, once Russia is defeated in Ukraine, we should provide NATO membership to Ukraine, and we should provide them with enough financial resources to rebuild.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio with me, Kate Chabot. And today we are talking to the financier and political activist, Bill Browder. He is the founder and CEO of Hermitage Capital Management and was the largest foreign investor in Russia until 2005, when he was denied entry to the country for exposing corruption. He's currently campaigning to impose sanctions against corrupt individuals linked to the Putin regime and to free political activists imprisoned by it. Bill Browder, welcome to Frontline. Thank you so much for your time. How precarious is President Putin's position at the moment?
In my opinion, he's truly on the ropes. This is the most significant threat to his power that's occurred in the last 23 years. The fact that there was an armed rebellion that really moved all the way through provincial Russia and made it within 2 hours of Moscow before it was diffused. I wouldn't say defeated. And the fact that the leader of this armed rebellion, Yevgeny Prigozhin, has not borne any significant consequences. Normally, if somebody attempts to take out the king, they better succeed. Because they'll get taken out, and nothing has happened. They didn't take him to Red Square, put him in a guillotine, and chop his head off. They didn't do anything to him, and so as I watch this situation unfold, I think that there is a huge chink in the armor of Vladimir Putin, and unless he does something very radical, he's a dead man walking.
And why do you think Yevgeny Prigozhin so far has not been sanctioned?
Well, it's a mystery, really. I mean, and it's worse than him not even be sanctioned. So during at the moment when he was had his convoy of 8,000 soldiers going through different Russian cities, the Russian security services raided his offices in St. Petersburg, where he ran his operations. And in that office raid, they found large amounts of cash, allegedly $111 million worth of cash in different currencies. That cash was at that time taken by the police. And as I understand it, that cash has now been returned to him. So not only has he not, nothing has happened to him, but even the cash that they had grabbed, they gave it back to him. And so there's something very fishy going on. And so why is that? Well, there's a number of things on the surface that we know, and a lot of things underneath the surface that we don't know. But what we do know on the surface is that Yevgeny Prigozhin is one of the few competent military men in Russia, and he was using his military competence to run operations in Africa. And there's 17 different Wagner mercenary operations in Africa, where that's effectively how Russia runs its foreign policy in Africa. So if he were to be killed or in some way taken out of circulation, then the entire Russian foreign policy in Africa and other places, Syria, for example, would probably either collapse or end up being put in a very precarious place.
And you believe that President Putin will now be embarking upon a purge, a massive purge, which you see both as terrible and optimistic at the same time. Why is that?
Well, so first of all, the only natural reaction to a strong man being humiliated is for the strong man to express his strength in a very visible way so other people don't then try to challenge him. And so either Putin embarks on a almighty purge where he reasserts his authority and scares everybody into submission, or he ends up finding himself in a position where either Prigozhin or somebody else has another run at him, and this time more successfully. And so I've seen it in other places. For example, in Turkey, when there was an attempted coup against President Erdogan, Erdogan arrested everybody and anybody who he had any distrust of. And there's like 50,000 people still to this day in Turkish prisons because of that. And so that's the kind of action I would expect of Putin. Interestingly, we're now, almost 2 weeks after this whole event, and we don't see that purge starting, which makes me believe that Putin really is in the most precarious position right now.
Now, a large part of your work is getting the Magnitsky Act passed in as many countries as possible, named after your late lawyer friend who was killed in custody in Russia. The idea to sanction, to seize assets of and ban the travel of corrupt individuals linked to the Putin regime. How effective is it proving?
Well, so the Magnitsky Act was the very first piece of legislation, first tool that was put in place to punish Putin and punish his regime. It was put in place in 2012, and the Magnitsky Act freezes the assets and bans the visas of people who are human rights violators and kleptocrats in Russia. And because Putin and his regime are so money focused, because their whole raison d'etre is to do terrible crimes in their own country, financial crimes and physical crimes connected to those financial crimes, and then keep that money in the West, this was a major blow to Putin. He values money more than human life, and his whole business model is to steal as much as possible. And so this was the first tool it put in place. He reacted violently to the passage of the Magnitsky Act. He went on a rampage. He banned the adoption of Russian orphans by American families in retaliation. He made it his single largest foreign policy priority to repeal the Magnitsky Act. He even sent a lawyer, a female lawyer named Natalia Veselnitskaya, from a Kremlin lawyer, to meet with Donald Trump Jr., Jared Kushner, and Paul Manafort at Trump Tower on June 9th, 2016, after Trump was nominated before he was elected, to beg for the repeal of the Magnitsky Act if he was elected. That hasn't happened. And what the Magnitsky Act has done is created a template which is now being used in all actions against Putin and his regime. And so all of the sanctions, the many thousands of people sanctioned in the UK and the EU and various other countries, all emanated from this Magnitsky Act. That was the basic template for causing trouble for the Putin regime. And Putin would like to have everybody think that these sanctions aren't hurting him. But I can tell you they are profoundly. Putin keeps most of his money in other people's names. That money is frozen in many cases. And Putin's degrees of freedom, his financial freedom, have been strongly curtailed because of the sanctions that emanated from the Magnitsky Act. And so I would argue that this is not the only thing that needs to be done in order to stop Putin from his murderous war in Ukraine, but it's a very important part of the whole package of actions that the West takes to try to basically curtail him.
So in that light, you wouldn't say that sanctions alone would go far enough to starve his war effort, effectively enough to end the war?
Well, sanctions could starve his war effort. So what have we done so far in the sanctions world? The West has frozen $350 billion of Russian central bank reserves. Originally, when Putin started the war, he had $650 billion in reserves, effectively his war chest. And more than half of that has been taken out of commission by the sanctions. The sanctions have also frozen the assets of about 45 of the top 118 oligarchs. These are people who hold Putin's money for him. And that money is no longer available to Putin for various nefarious purposes. The sanctions have also made it impossible for the Russian government and Russian companies and Russian banks to borrow money on the international capital markets, which means that whatever money that they don't have access to in their own accounts, they can't replenish it with borrowing. But the one place where the sanctions have not hit, which is the elephant in the room, is that Russia exports between $500 million and $1 billion a day of oil and gas. And that export flow continues, and the money flow from those exports continues back into Russia. And we haven't had the stomach to basically do a full embargo a global embargo on this Russian sale of oil. And if we did that, that would starve Putin of the ability to further conduct this war. It's both practical, possible, and it should be done. The way it's possible, people say, well, the Indians or the Chinese are buying this oil. How do you prevent them from doing it? Well, the oil has to go on boats. It has to go on oil tankers, and those boats can be, for example, we could pass a law. The West could pass a law to say that any oil tanker that moves any drop of Russian oil can no longer dock in any port in the EU, in the United States, and Canada, and Japan. We could also say that any ship owner would no longer have access to insurance for their ships if they were moving Russian oil. And we could also say to the Indians and Chinese that any entity that's involved in the refining of that oil would be put on the U.S. sanctions list or the EU sanctions list. And if we did all those things, that would prevent the Russian government from continuing to sell their oil. However, the reason we don't is that we're in a world of inflation, inflation and cost of living crisis, and nobody wants to exacerbate that by cutting off Russian oil and having the oil price rise. And so that's the real elephant in the room. If we were to stop the flow of oil from Russia to the West, the money would run out and Putin wouldn't be able to conduct his war. And we're in this strange situation where, on one hand, we don't want to jam up the price of oil for inflation purposes, and on the other hand, then we're having to dig into our own pockets to give money to Ukraine to fight off the Russians. So we're giving money to Russia through the sale of oil to kill Ukrainians, and then we're giving money to Ukraine to fight back. The easy solution is to not have Russia have any more money.
Makes total sense when you explain it like that. Now, a large part of your work is trying to free political prisoners in Russia. And we in particular have been following the incarceration of the American journalist Evan Gershkovich. You are campaigning for you are campaigning for Vladimir Karamurza, a Russian British national, to be freed. Tell me a bit more about your colleague and what you know about his condition.
So Vladimir Karamurza is a Russian British journalist and opposition activist. He was born in Russia. He came to the UK in his teenage years. He studied at Cambridge University and got his degree in history and political science from Cambridge. He went back to Russia as a journalist, and then eventually what he saw under the Putin regime was this unbelievable criminality, and he became a political opposition activist. As part of his opposition work, he joined me in the campaign to get Magnitsky Acts passed across the world, and he explained to many parliaments and governments how important it was that the West didn't enable Putin and didn't allow him to commit these terrible crimes in Russia and keep their money safely in our banks in the West. And his testimony was extremely powerful, very valuable, and was responsible for the Magnitsky Act being passed in the United States and 34 additional countries after that. Vladimir Putin hates the Magnitsky Act because it targets everything he cares about, which is money. And in retaliation, Vladimir Putin tried to have Vladimir killed. He was poisoned in the summer of 2015 with an unknown nerve agent, which caused him to go into a coma, multiple organ failure, and the doctors gave him a 5% chance of survival. He miraculously survived. He then returned to Russia. He went through a year of rehabilitation, but then he returned to Russia to continue his campaign against the Putin regime. And he was poisoned with the same poison in 2017. Thankfully, the same doctors that treated him in 2015 were able to save his life a second time. And then when the war started, when Putin invaded Ukraine in February of 2022, about a month later, he went back to Russia against the advice of me and all of his friends to protest the war. He went on to MSNBC and CNN, openly calling the war a war, which is illegal in Russia. People who do that get sentenced to 8 years in prison. He then went further and called Putin a war criminal and a mass murderer. And he was subsequently arrested I think the same day as the CNN interview. And they then charged him with a number of crimes, including high treason. And he was found guilty and sentenced to 25 years in prison. Interestingly, one of the judges, there was a panel of 3 judges, one of the judges who found him guilty and sentenced him to 25 years in prison was a judge who he campaigned to be put on the Magnitsky list for being involved in the murder of Sergei Magnitsky, my lawyer. And so he's responsible for this judge being sanctioned, and then the judge retaliates by sentencing him to 25 years in prison. He still suffers from the horrible after effects of this poison that he was subjected to back in 2015 and 2017. And so now in prison, he's lost about 25 kilos. He looks like he's skeletal. He's lost the sensation in both of his feet. He has peripheral nerve damage from the poison. It's called polyneuropathy. He's starting to lose the sensation in the left side of his body. And left untreated, which is how it is being left untreated, they're not giving him any medical attention, it could lead to total paralysis and death. And so I don't believe that there's any chance that he'll survive a 25-year sentence. I don't even think he'll survive a 5-year sentence. And so I'm spending a lot of my time, energy, and resources campaigning to get him out of prison. And one of the things which I'm trying to do is get the British government to actually wake up and help him. And you mentioned at the beginning of your question the case of Evan Gershkovich. Evan Gershkovich is a Wall Street Journal reporter who was arrested and taken hostage and deserving of all of the world's attention. But strangely, Rishi Sunak has mentioned Evan Gershkovich on a number of occasions, has never mentioned the name Vladimir Kara-Murza, even though Vladimir Kara-Murza is a journalist and a British citizen. The British government is providing Vladimir with sort of basic consular services. What that means is they'll provide him with English language periodicals and warm socks in the winter, but they're not going to bat. I don't hear any public statements that the British government is trying to free Vladimir Kara-Murza, and I find that really upsetting and shameful, and it really reflects badly on a much bigger problem, which is that the British government, when you get taken hostage, if you got a British blue passport, don't expect the government to do anything for you, and there's many other cases just like it.
We've actually asked the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office for response to the points that you're making. And so far, the comments they've made about this is that they've condemned that his incarceration and the sentencing. And they say they've already sanctioned the judge and will consider further measures. So I'm guessing it's one we're going to have to watch for further developments on this. But it has emerged that 2 British peers were among 50 people at a party by the Russian ambassador to the UK to mark the creation of the Russia, independent Russia of the Soviet Union. This happened in the last week. How confused do you think the UK's, and by extension the West's, relationship has been up until now with Russia?
Well, so what we had going on up until 2022, February 2022, was a complete sort of appeasement approach towards Russia from Britain, from the EU, from the United States, and various other places. And one of the reasons for this appeasement approach was everybody really enjoyed all of the financial benefits that Russia provided. So if you were in Germany, you loved the cheap Russian gas. Same thing in Italy and Austria. If you were in the UK, you loved the oligarch money. And so what we saw was that all these people became almost addicts to Russia, to Russian influence and Russian financial influence. And this was really very upsetting for me. I spent 10 years trying to get the West to basically stop this appeasement and start to contain Putin and to call him what he is, which is a criminal. And nobody wanted to go anywhere near that because everybody enjoyed the money. And there was a lot of people in the House of Lords who were on the Russian payroll. This stuff was on and on and on in the UK on a regular basis. And everybody sort of stopped. And now we discover that there are 2 members of the House of Lords going to the Russian embassy to celebrate Independence Day for Russia from the Soviet Union, while Putin is bombing civilians in Ukraine. It's shocking.
If we're to look a little further at the confused standards, can I ask the same question about China? Because we see the US Treasury Secretary in Beijing this week. This is days after China hosted 2 Russian warships, which had sailed past Taiwan and Japan and are due to take part in a joint drill with the Chinese. What do you think of those circumstances?
Well, I mean, we're falling into the same exact trap we did with Russia. So everybody said, yes, Russia, Putin's bad, but we need to do business with him. And look what we've done. We've provided, we sort of enabled him, and we gave him the sort of green light that he could go into Ukraine and nothing would happen. And now we're doing the same thing with China. China is a hostile dictatorship. They just took over Hong Kong. They violated and abrogated all sorts of terms of the treaty that was signed. They're now eyeing up Taiwan. They're imprisoning Uyghurs in concentration camps. And we're busy sending trade missions. That we should be doing everything we can to extricate ourselves from any kind of mutual dependence on China, because they will use any kind of economic leverage they have to carry on and doing malign things around their borders and in other places. And we've seen it before. This is the same playbook as the Russians played, and now it's being played out in China, and we're falling into the same trap. And I think it's a very big mistake.
What do you think the consequences could be?
Well, the consequences are going to be that if we end up in a situation where we're doing more business with China and they were to invade Taiwan, we either have to then suffer a bigger economic consequence if we decide to condemn that, or if we decide to sanction them, or if we decide to support Taiwan militarily, or the alternative is that there's no economic consequence and they get away with murder. And either of them are two things that we don't want to have happen. And so the ideal situation is to, instead of expanding our economic interactions with China, we should be cutting them down, cutting them off. And so that by the time, even if there's a short-term cost, so we don't end up having a major long-term cost like we're seeing with the war in Ukraine.
You've talked about the need for a more muscular foreign policy when a country invades another in Europe. Where has the foreign policy gone wrong?
Well, the foreign policy went wrong. The entire foreign policy was a Chamberlain-esque policy of appeasement up until the moment that Putin rolled across the border on February last year. We have been just craven appeasers of Vladimir Putin, and that foreign policy didn't work. And if we had a foreign policy like we actually have right now as far as Russia is concerned, which is a very tough policy, if we had done that after, for example, the invasion of Georgia in 2008, Putin might not have moved on Crimea. Or if we had a very tough policy after he moved on Crimea, he might not have had the confidence to do a full-scale invasion of Ukraine last year. Everything is all about rewards and risks. Every dictator looks at what's available to them, what kind of actions they can take that would be helpful to them. And in Putin's case, it was helpful to him to invade Ukraine because his power was waning after 23 years as president. And he thought that a good foreign invasion would elevate his approval ratings. So that was the upside for him. And he thought there's no downside. Every time I've done something bad, these guys all just carry on doing business with me. They all very narrowly just want the money to continue to flow. And so he was under the impression that he was going to go into Ukraine. We were going to issue a few statements and carry on doing business with him. And if he had seen that there was a risk that was so great that the reward wouldn't be justified, he might not have done it. And that's what a muscular foreign policy means, which is creating enough sense of consequence and creating consequences when necessary, so that both the people you're dealing with and others who are looking on don't have the impression that you're a pushover. And that's why we need to be much more aggressive about China and perhaps even more aggressive about Russia in terms of oil, not allowing them to sell their oil, providing more lethal weapons to Ukraine. Where are the F-16s? What about these long-range missiles that they're asking for, et cetera.
Of course, members of NATO are meeting in Vilnius next week. And it's not that long ago that the French president actually described NATO as brain dead. What do you think NATO needs to do going forward?
Well, it's pretty obvious that Russia invades countries that are not NATO members and doesn't invade countries that are NATO members. So there's going to be a moment in time when Ukraine will have hopefully pushed back Russia out of their borders. And one of two things will happen after that. Either Russia will then rearm and have another go, or Ukraine joins NATO and Russia doesn't do it anymore. It's as simple as that. And we everybody says we don't want to directly be involved in a war with Russia, and therefore we don't want Ukraine to be part of NATO because they're involved in a war with Russia. Well, Russia doesn't want to be involved in a war with NATO, and so it's very simple that if Ukraine was part of NATO, this wouldn't have happened in the first place. If Ukraine becomes part of NATO at a moment when the whole thing calms down, there won't be any more trouble with Russia invading Ukraine. And so Ukraine should be admitted into NATO. And to the extent that is it a question, are they a net benefit or detractor from NATO? They become the most fierce fighting force in Europe now, probably more fierce than we are. And so I think that it would be to the great benefit, to the great defense of all of NATO to have Ukrainian allies in this fight.
And you would like frozen Russian assets to be redistributed in the future to rebuild Ukraine. How optimistic are you that that can actually happen?
So Putin invades Ukraine in February 2022. He causes $1 trillion of damage as a part of his invasion, and the number keeps on rising. At the beginning of the invasion, we have frozen $350 billion of central bank reserves. It seems absolutely morally and financially sensible that we don't just freeze that money, but we seize it and we use that money for the defense and reconstruction of Ukraine. The Russians are arguing, you can't do that. This money is protected by law, the law of sovereign immunity. In the same way as our embassy is protected, this money belongs to the government of Russia, and therefore it should be protected. And it just doesn't work that way. You can't invade a foreign country, create $1 trillion of damages, and then say, I'm protected by law. There's another law, which is the law of countermeasures, which says that if you create that kind of damage, that money should be confiscated. And so I believe that eventually the financial realities of this whole story are going to play themselves out. And we in the West, who are at the moment tiptoeing around this money, we're saying, oh my God, we don't want to do anything that might be seen to be legally controversial. Well, I don't think that when we're starting to raise taxes in order to rebuild Ukraine, people are going to be all that worried about the legal controversy. I think there's a legal case. Many top international legal experts have said it's legal and have come up with very clear explanations for how it can be done. And it's sort of the obvious thing. We're going to still have to dig into our pockets because the damage done to Ukraine is far bigger than the amount of money that's been frozen of Russian central bank reserves. But that's a clear, obvious, and sensible place to start.
Suffice it to say, then, you are optimistic.
Well, so at the very beginning of the war, none of the West would even supply tanks to Ukraine, and now there's hundreds and hundreds of tanks going in. We wouldn't supply long-range missiles. Now there's lots of long-range missiles going in. I believe that I don't know whether it's a year or 2 years or 6 months, but I believe that it's sort of a no-brainer that this is going to happen, because why would we basically allow Russia to use law to protect their money when they're violating the law in such a profound way and killing so many people and creating so much damage to Ukraine? It doesn't make any sense.
The way this war ends will have so many consequences for Europe. What is the best scenario for it and for wider global stability?
Well, the way that this war should end is that we should give the Ukrainians what they need to forcefully expel Russian troops from their sovereign territory, and that includes Crimea. And then after that, once Russia is defeated in Ukraine, we should provide NATO membership to Ukraine, and we should provide them with enough financial resources to rebuild. And then we should create the Iron Curtain again. What I mean by that is that we should create a set of disincentives for Russia ever to try this again to any neighbor that we care about. And we should be absolutely brutal about it. And we should not in any way have a re-engagement, a reset, an appeasement of Russia. This is a country that doesn't believe in international law, doesn't believe in respect for its neighbors. It's a conquest country, and we should stop them from doing that. And so we had this situation during the Cold War, and a Cold War is a lot better than a hot war, which is what we're involved in right now. And so to the extent that we get to this place, the key is to be so robust, like we were during the Soviet times, that they never try anything again.
So do you think then that one of the lessons that will be taken away from this whole experience, the war in Ukraine, is that appeasement politics is over?
Well, the lesson should be taken that appeasement politics is over. I don't know if it will be taken. And as you mentioned before, you have in the midst of China flexing its military muscles, you have trade missions with senior UK officials going to China. I think we haven't learned the lesson yet. We're sort of addicts, and we keep on going back to the dealer when we should be basically understanding that there's a lot of people in the world that don't believe in the same things we believe in and will do harm unless we have a robust policy. And we can still do business with bad countries as long as they understand that we have tough values, and if they cross a line, we'll do something about it.
Bill Browder, it's been great speaking to you. Thank you very much for joining us on Frontline. You've been watching Frontline for Times Radio. My thanks to Louis Sykes, our producer. To support the work of Frontline, hit the subscribe button. You can also listen to Times Radio throughout the day or read it at times.co.uk. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.